First scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. And remember that the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel that was written, and we believe it was written about 40 years after the death of Jesus. When the Sabbath was over, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought perfumed oils so they could anoint Jesus. Very early, just after sunrise on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the tomb?" When they looked, they found that the huge stone had been rolled back. On entering the tomb, they saw a young person sitting at the right, dressed in a white robe. They were very frightened, but the youth reassured them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? Now go and tell the disciples and Peter, Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you." They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling. But they said nothing to anyone because they were so afraid. Ancient words for our time now.
Our second scripture reading is from Luke. Loving one, you are my shepherd. I want nothing more. You let me lie down in green meadows. You lead me beside restful waters. You refresh my soul. You guide me to lush pastures for the sake of your name. Even if I'm surrounded by shadows of death, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they give me courage. You spread a table for me in the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Only goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in your house, O loving one, for days without end. So ends our scripture readings.
Well, like Daniel said, thank you all for being here. Maybe next Easter we'll get to have a real service in the same room, but it still means a lot to see your faces. So anybody who's been at St. Andrews for a while knows that Easter is a very challenging time for me to preach. It's where, my past of hearing bad funeral sermons and bad Easter sermons, hearing preachers pretend to know things that no human being can possibly know, haunts me. And I see that the smile of a minister who's just said something that they can't possibly know whether it's true or not, but sitting there with that smile, I think of it as the funeral smirk. And that's the last thing I want you to experience today. On the one hand, I think whatever we have to do to get through the traumas of life, I think that's what we need to do. It gets us through the day. But at some point, we begin to question how helpful it really is to tell ourselves certain stories that at another level we know may not be true. As kids, it may be comforting to hear someone say, "This won't hurt a bit." But after a while, we realize it sometimes does hurt a whole lot, or when somebody says everything's going to work out. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes that isn't true. And when a preacher says God never gives us more than we can carry, sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's terribly untrue. The reason I turn to stories from Scripture is kind of untraditional. I believe, for me, the greatest value of Scripture is that it is mythological. And by that, I don't mean that it's untrue. I mean that they're personal stories that are told in a way that illustrate the great themes of living and of life in a way that we can feel them, even when we're frightened or in pain. I remember when I was a little kid and I'd get afraid in the night. I'd crawl into bed with my parents. Not on my dad's side, he wasn't too crazy about that, but on my mom's side, and she would tell me stories. And sometimes they were Bible stories, like David and Goliath. Sometimes they were tall tales, like Pecos Bill. But what I always loved about them was that they were illustrating great truths, and they gave me courage. And as I listen to Scripture, that's what inspires me. I don't need history about what happened 2,000 years ago. I don't need the science of Scripture. That's clearly been shown to be wrong. But these stories reoccur all over the world. And the reason they do that, I think, is because they guide us along the way. This week in one of our conversations in living class, Barbara Franson said that the two most personal times of the year, Christmas and Easter, are those times that are most personal for us, of birth and death. And I think that's one aspect of what myth does. The other is that it puts it in a cosmic context. So I find it very interesting that the personal story of birth in the Christian tradition is put in the darkest part of winter. And this story of the death of this young rabbi is put in the vernal equinox, when spring is beginning. And I think that is an attempt to help us understand that even though life is incredibly painful at times, that we're part of a larger story. And it's not something we have to believe some preacher. We look at life around us and we realize we are part of the cosmos, and that these stories are the songs of life, the great hymns of the universe. And we don't have to take them at face value. Something deep within us resonates, because we are children of the universe, and whatever the source is, whether it's a being or whether it's being itself, that these stories help us feel that we belong. Mark's gospel is the earliest, as Carol was saying, and it's also with the gospel with the least trappings. It doesn't have the virgin birth, and in its original form, it doesn't have the resurrection stories. It ends just with an empty tomb. And I think that may have been what the disciples experienced objectively in history, and that the resurrection stories are what was happening within them spiritually. The great insights and revelations and enlightenment that they experienced. One of the clues that you find in mystical literature is when it talks about the seventh day of the week. And it says this story happened right after that. That's a clue in a lot of mystical poetry that is talking about the eighth day of the week. And those are those moments that we step outside of time and place. We're so deeply inspired, and we see a beauty that just stops time for us. Or there's music that lifts us out of whatever bog we find ourselves in. And this is a story that's happening on that next day after the Sabbath. And what that tells you is that the disciples are experiencing something from within themselves. These are stories and truths that happen through us, not to us. That we are expressions of the cosmos and the universe. And one of the mistakes that traditional religion makes is telling us that we're going to find these truths objectively outside in the world, or that they happen objectively outside the world. If Christmas had really had angels singing on the roof, everybody in Bethlehem would have been converted, right? If when Jesus died, there was a great earthquake and all of the dead got up and walked again, everybody would have converted. It's not what is happening externally, it's the experience that people are having at the time. The other disciples tell the stories of the resurrection stories, and they're different and they contradict each other, is what you'd expect from poetry. But Matthew just gives us an empty grave. And in some ways, I think this is the most helpful Easter experience of all, because sometimes that's what life looks like. Sometimes we may want to believe that there'll be these great visions and revelations, but sometimes new life looks like an empty tomb to us. Things have changed. Growth may sound good in principle, but it hurts. It's like a baby's new tooth. It's coming up through the flesh, and it hurts when this new tooth is born. And sometimes to learn the great truths, great spiritual truths of life, are not comfortable. They hurt us. And this story of the person in white, other stories have it being an angel. In Mark, it's just somebody in white. The word angel, I believe, shows up in the Greek, but that can also mean messenger. But the white robe symbolized somebody who'd been through the mystery initiation. This is somebody who's our sibling, who's further down the road than we are in these stories. And you can almost hear this person saying to us that although life looks like an empty tomb, we've been there before. When we've loved and lost and our hearts are so broken, we think that we'll never find joy again. We've been there before. When we've lost someone or something that we love so much that life seems bleak. It seems like a grave. That mysterious being in white reminds us that we have healed before and that we will heal again, and that our world will be bigger, that this revelation will take us bigger and deeper into life. If you look at Christianity from a mythic viewpoint, there's all kinds of symbols of other religions. And one of the religions was the birth of the sun. And those stories haunt the Easter and the birth stories. When you see the rooster and it's just kind of stuck in there, and you say, what is a rooster doing in the story? And then there's the Nile and the rooster crows 3 times. In this kind of literature, the roosters symbolize the sun and the birth of a new age. When does the rooster crow? It crows at dawn. So in the midst of this failure and this denial that's taking place, the new life still begins. Even if we don't know what to do, it happens through us, not just to us. That there's a life within us, a life force within us. We are not aliens of nature. We are expressions of nature. And I think what that figure in the white robe does is take us by the hand out into a field and points down and says, look closely. Everything that is being born is coming out of something that has died. This is not some old preacher talking what they don't know. It's looking at your life more deeply and profoundly and realizing that what we call life and what we call death are not opposites. You can't have one without the other. That there's a larger pattern there. There's a larger movement there. And this is where our true life can be found. In mystical literature, eternity is not finding that which is unchanging. In mystical literature, eternity means finding that by which everything changes. This is very, very important. We don't find in our lives something that doesn't change. But there is a principle by which everything changes. And that is our peace. That is our home. And Easter calls us to that mysterious something, that mysterious song that is there. New truths, when we see them, look like darkness. And that's the experience that the people coming into this tomb are going to have. You walk into the tomb from the bright lights, and there seems like there's nothing there. And all of a sudden you see this person in white garb. A lot of times we think that truth is going to be like, a Hallmark card, and it just gives us gentle insight. And sometimes that's true, but great truths can be devastating because we realize that our old way of perceiving has got to go. There's a saying in the Gospel of Thomas that I really like. It quotes Jesus, similar but sometimes different from our Gospels. Saying number 2 says, Jesus said, "Those who seek should never stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and rule over all." A lot of times when we think of truth, we think of something that's kind of comforting, and a lot of times it is, but other times it's in our depression, it's in our bewilderment, in our confusion that we find our way in our path, and just letting our eyes settle in a new situation that we don't like, that we never would have chosen. But that person in white is saying, trust life. It doesn't seem like this could ever get better, but you've been here before. Trust life, trust yourself. There's a song that we don't use at St. Andrews because of the language, but I think we could translate it and use it. In the language of the song is the Lord of the Dance, and that's problematic for us because it's a masculine image of the sacred, and also one of power and domination. If we're not careful, that word Lord. But if we translate it as the heart of the dance, I think it's one of the most beautiful and mystical songs there is. If we say, "Dance then wherever you may be. I am the heart of the dance," said she, "and I'll lead you all wherever you may be, for I am the heart of the dance," said he. Life is this shape-shifting, it can hurt so bad, but life is change. And we try to make life permanent. We try to hold on to it and we strangle it. But these stories teach us to relax, to let go. In some of the other versions of the gospel, Jesus says, "Don't hold on to me." And when they find the risen being, Christ says, "Don't hold on to me, let go. This is still happening. This is still a process." Matthew doesn't even have Jesus show up. And I think a lot of the reason why so many of the resurrection stories are of mistaken identity is because the disciples are beginning to see what Christ was talking about all around them, in themselves, in each other. And it's not something you have to believe in. It's an experience that you and I can have. So there are times in life when it feels like we've been abandoned, that we've been orphaned, that we've been left behind. that love has moved on. Sometimes when we meet somebody who really loves us and they have boundaries, that can feel like rejection. Healthy love can hurt in that sense and feel like we're being pushed back. But what we discover is that there are higher levels of love and loving. And what we discover when we lose someone who we loved as much as life itself is that it was the life that we loved in the person and not the form. Again, this is incredibly important, but at the time we can't know that. We can't remember that. When you lose somebody who's your very heart, you're not going to be able to feel this at the time. And what the story is trying to do is help you feel somebody's hand in yours, saying you have felt in the past that you have lost something that you couldn't replace in life. And yet now you see that beautiful something everywhere. You go to a cemetery and you are focused on the grave, and all of a sudden you hear the songs of the birds. You hear the wind in the trees, and you see beautiful wildflowers, and you realize that's closer to the person that you loved than that grave is. That's the experience I think the disciples are having. They're feeling it all around them. Well, that's my Easter sermon, and thank God another one is behind me. I always hate going on Google because it has criticisms of my earlier Easter hymns from Orthodox theologians, but I really think that these stories are mythic, and that's what makes them so wonderful. They're not talking about somewhere else. They're talking about right here, your life right now as you live it. They're personal stories that illustrate these cosmic truths in a way that those truths can become yours. So when we look around our world and it looks like an empty tomb, when we've lost so much that we just don't know how we're going to keep going on, the story puts a hand in our hand and leads us out into our own backyard and says, look, life is growing from yesterday's death. You cannot believe this right now, but trust in life. You will heal, you will love again, and you will find joy again. Then a lot of times we look around us and all we see is confusion and darkness. And what that hand in our hand tells us is that we've been there before too. And that confusion settled and became wisdom. And that will happen again. That person in white says, trust life. And find there have been times when we felt like we were left behind by life. We've completely alone and orphaned, and that the world had gone on. And our story reminds us that eternity is not a place where everything doesn't change. Eternity is that principle by which everything changes. And I think the reason these stories appeal to me so much is because I still hear them told in a weary parent's voice to a frightened young kid who's crawled into bed. And I know that they're not stories of history or science. They're the song of life. And they're saying in so many different ways, dance then wherever you may be. I am the heart of the dance, said he, and I'll lead you all wherever you may be, for I am the heart of the dance, said she. I invite you now to your own reflection on this story.